He was a methodical and careful flyer who bristled at his own reputation for taking risks. By redefining the capabilities of aircraft, he became a celebrity on a scale never known before and had to go almost literally to the ends of the earth to get away from the paparazzi. He was a beloved symbol of American ingenuity and bravery, but during World War II was refused induction into the Army Air Corps at the direct order of the President of the United States. He was Charles Lindbergh, and he is a legend of air power. Charles Augustus Lindbergh was born on February 4th, 1902 in Detroit. He was the son of Evangeline Lodge and Charles Augustus Lindbergh Sr., a farmer who was elected to Congress in 1906. Lindbergh Sr. was an isolationist who believed staunchly that foreign entanglements served only the wealthy and powerful. His son, known from an early age as Slim, grew up on a farm near Little Falls, Minnesota, and studied engineering at the University of Wisconsin. He dropped out after 2 years and moved to Lincoln, Nebraska, where there was an affordable flight school. Flying for Charles Lindbergh was a transcendent, almost spiritual experience. "I live only in the moment," he wrote in his autobiography, "in this strange and unmortal space, crowded with beauty, pierced with danger." Even after being trained as a pilot, Slim couldn't find anyone willing to risk their aircraft by allowing him to solo. Desperate to continue flying, he volunteered as a wing walker for a Barnstormer. They toured the Midwest through the summer of 1922, when Lindbergh hooked up with another act, this time as a parachute jumper. Parachutes in those days were new and untrustworthy, and parachute jumping was thought of as significantly more dangerous than wing walking. He toured as Daredevil Lindbergh, but after another year of risking his life to fly, he still had not soloed. In 1923, Lindbergh's father decided to run for the Senate as part of the Isolationist Farmer Labor Party. Slim convinced him that an airplane would help drum up publicity. His father co-signed a $500 loan that Slim used to buy an Army surplus Curtiss Jenny. He picked the plane up in Americus, Georgia. Taxiing around the airport, getting the feel of the controls, Slim gave the engine too much gas and accidentally took off. His first solo lasted only a few seconds and rattled more experienced pilots who witnessed it. Returning to Minnesota, Lindbergh crashed the Jenny into a swamp. After making repairs, he hit the campaign trail with his father. Charles Sr. placed third in the primary, but Slim had his airplane. As soon as the votes were counted, he took the Jenny and returned to Barnstorming before enlisting in the Army Air Service Cadet program. In 1924, the Army had almost no interest in aviation. In the isolationist environment after World War I, the armed forces were shrinking. Training concentrated as much on processing Army paperwork as flight, and 80% of cadets never got their wings. Slim studied hard and earned a reputation as a barracks prankster. In the air, he was clearly the best in his class. He was selected as a pursuit pilot and trained in obsolete de Havillands known as flaming coffins. Assigned to fly tedious figure eights, Lindbergh risked expulsion by challenging other cadets to simulated aerial combat. Of the 104 cadets who entered with Lindbergh, 14 graduated. Panicked at the thought of taking the written test to receive his regular Army commission, Lindbergh withdrew and opted for a reserve assignment. In 1926, he returned to St. Louis and went to work for Robinson Aviation, which had a contract to fly mail between St. Louis and Chicago. Lindbergh surveyed the flight route and on April 26 flew the first scheduled delivery between the two cities. Flying above the Midwest in those days was not much different from flying over the open ocean. There were few highways to follow, and before rural electrification, there were no lights to guide pilots at night. Lindbergh crashed more than once, but always rescued the mail sacks out of the wreckage and hand-carried them on to their destination. Navigating between Chicago and St. Louis, the isolation of the cockpit was anything but lonesome for the young pilot. Looking out at the passing countryside, he let his imagination roam. All over the world, aviation records were being set and rebroken. Hardly a day passed without word of another amazing feat. Flying over the endless fields of Illinois, Lindbergh cooked up a plan as audacious as any to come before. He decided to try to do what no one had ever done, and to do it the same way he flew every single day, alone. In 1919, New York hotel owner Raymond Orteig put up $25,000 as a prize for the first person to fly nonstop from New York to Paris. His offer, he said, was good for 5 years. Aviation technology was so primitive that no one even tried. In 1926, Orteig extended the offer another 5 years. Technology had caught up with his vision, and on both sides of the Atlantic, teams of aviators went to work designing aircraft that could handle the flight.
Aviation contests were really what we would consider the X-series programs of their day. We had formalized flight testing and flight research start very, very early in aeronautical history. And these aviation contests, speed contests, altitude contests, distance contests, what those really did was encourage the development of airplanes that really extended the frontiers of flight.
The conventional wisdom held that crossing the ocean required huge, multi-engine aircraft, heavy with supplies and fuel. French aviator René Fonck selected a tri-motored Sikorsky biplane. He outfitted it with a folding sofa bed and planned a menu including Long Island duckling and, of course, champagne. On September 26, 1926, Fonck's craft lumbered down the runway at New York's Roosevelt Field and crashed without leaving the ground. 2 of his crewmen died in the crash. Admiral Robert Byrd, the polar explorer, assembled a slightly smaller entourage based in a Fokker trimotor. At the end of its first test flight, the plane nosed over on the runway and crashed. In St. Louis, however, Lindbergh was hard at work on his much simpler idea. He approached a group of local businessmen seeking funding for a much more modest mission. One man, flying alone, crossing the Atlantic. Flying alone decreased the payload and the amount of fuel necessary to make the crossing. He could use a smaller plane with a single engine, cutting the weight and fuel consumption even more. Lindbergh raised $8,500, partly by assuring his partners that once the Orteig Prize had been won, he would put the plane to work flying mail from St. Louis to New York. Finding a plane was harder than Lindbergh had thought. Manufacturers of suitable aircraft declined to bet their reputations on an unknown pilot with an apparent death wish. Fokker wouldn't even consider it. A negotiation with Belanca fell through when management demanded the right to name its own pilot. Lindbergh was about to give up when he received word that Ryan Aircraft was interested. Lindbergh, fully aware that others were planning their flights to Paris, gave Ryan 24 hours to design a plane that suited his needs.
The Ryan Company, which was a very forward-thinking company, did a superb job integrating appropriate technology into that airplane. They took the radial piston engine, which was a major American development in the 1920s, the highly reliable radial piston engine. They took advanced structural techniques and construction. They took advanced instrumentation that was available. They adopted the streamlined monoplane configuration to get maximum range and reduce drag, and put this all together in a very nice package, and that, of course, was the Spirit of St. Louis.
On April 28th, 60 days after Lindbergh placed the order with Ryan, the newly christened Spirit of St. Louis took off for its first test flight. It had a wingspan of 46 feet and weighed, when empty, 2,150 pounds. The engine was a Wright J5C Whirlaway, one of the most trustworthy power plants in the world. A huge fuel tank filled the space between the engine and the cockpit, blocking the pilot's view, but giving the plane a 4,000-mile range. Lindbergh flew from San Diego to New York following a Rand-McNally road atlas. In the process, he set a transcontinental speed record of 21 hours and 45 minutes. Though the press assumed that one of the bigger name flyers preparing to cross the ocean would win the Orteig Prize, the public latched on to Lindbergh as soon as he arrived in New York. He was thin and photogenic and single. The Wright Company, which had refused to supply him an aircraft, outfitted him instead with a publicist who kept the newspapers interested. Reporters inundated him with irrelevant questions about his favorite pie and his preference in women. The New York Times paid $5,000 for exclusive rights to his story. On the morning of May 20th, 1927, Lindbergh posed for a few pictures, looking distracted and impatient. He had not slept the night before. He climbed into the cockpit. His only provisions, a couple of canteens of water and 5 sandwiches he'd bought the night before at a diner. With 2,700 pounds of fuel in a 2,100-pound plane, it seemed a miracle the plane lifted off at all. At least one member of Lindbergh's crew sobbed that Slim would never be seen alive again.
What's interesting about Lindbergh is that Lindbergh is far more than the popular image of him at the time. At the time, people called him Lucky Lindy, some called him the Lone Eagle, some even called him the Flying Fool. He was really none of those things. He made his own luck. He understood exactly what the requirements were for that mission. He plotted it, he planned it, he undertook it with tremendous deliberation and with a tremendous appreciation of his strengths, his weaknesses, and the strengths and weaknesses of the airplane and every other part of that system that came together.
33 and a half hours after he left New York, Lindbergh circled over Paris. Alerted when he passed over the Irish coast 6 hours earlier, the French thronged to the airport to see him arrive. More than 100,000 people waited on the floodlit field as the Spirit of St. Louis touched down. There are several versions of what Lindbergh first said when the crowd reached his plane. The newspapers variously reported his first words as, "I'm Charles Lindbergh," and "Is this Paris?" According to Lindbergh, his first words were, "Are there any mechanics here? And does anybody here speak English?"
With the astronauts in the 1960s, you had at least a year or two of buildup to get used to the idea of one of these 7 individuals being the first American in space. Whereas in the case of Lindbergh, he blows in from the West Coast. 2 days later, he takes off across the North Atlantic, and 3 days after that, he's a world hero. You know, he was a man literally of about 2 weeks, from being a nothing to all of a sudden being an extraordinary celebrity at a level of public recognition and awareness that we really can't even imagine today.
Lindbergh returned to the United States on the American warship Memphis. While at sea, he had no idea of the frenzy building around his arrival. Everyone wanted to meet him. There was a new dance craze, the Lindy Hop, named in his honor. The post office was issuing an airmail stamp with his image on it. Congress had created a new medal, Distinguished Flying Cross, so they could honor him in a way no one else had ever been honored. It was like nothing that had ever come before. There were new mass media, radio, and newsreels hungering for heroes and real-life cliffhangers, fighting fiercely to retain the public's attention. Aviators were natural subjects. Every year, airplanes flew faster, higher, and farther. There were racers who accepted the very real risk of sudden death. Into that highly charged atmosphere stepped Charles Lindbergh, a matinee cowboy of the sky. Tall, photogenic, modest, he was the real deal in a world of artifice, and everyone wanted a piece of him.
I think the appeal is the appeal of anything that is new and radically different that is going to transform society. And if we really think about what aviation meant to people like Lindbergh, after the beginning of the 20th century, here we had a subject and a field of inquiry that was going to radically transform everything.
He came home and was at the center of attention no matter where he went. People listened raptly to everything he said, despite the fact that the shy flyer had little profound to say. He wrote a book. In a few days, it sold almost 200,000 copies.
I think he was astonished by the public adulation he received after his flight, which he saw as just a very straightforward event. It was certainly not done on his part in a bid to become famous or to become well-known.
Lindbergh, who was fairly sophisticated in the ways of publicity from his barnstorming days, had no objection to getting rich. He played the publicity game effectively, but what he really wanted was to return to flight. He considered attempting the Pacific, but no corporation would underwrite anything that put him at risk. So he took the Spirit of St. Louis on a national tour, and everywhere he went, the crowds and the microphones awaited him. Sometimes there were so many people at the airport, there was no place for him to land. On a goodwill trip to Mexico, he met Anne Morrow, the daughter of the American ambassador and a student at Smith College. Though he said nothing at the time, he noted years later that he was smitten with her from the first. But there was no time to linger, and it was months until his busy schedule of celebrity barnstorming allowed him to see her again.
He was not content merely to rest on his laurels. He felt that he had a larger mission to fulfill, and that larger mission was what people termed in those days the gospel of aviation. He had this mission to make America air-minded.
Lindbergh proposed to his St. Louis backers that they start an airline. With Lindbergh's name attached, both the number of people willing to fly and the market for airline stocks exploded. Lindbergh's partners quickly raised $10 million to start transcontinental air transport, the first coast-to-coast airline. In June 1929, Charles and Anne Morrow married in a secret ceremony. When word leaked out, the media launched a worldwide search to find the honeymooners. They did, on a 38-foot motorboat anchored in York Harbor, Maine. After their marriage, Charles taught Anne to fly. Vanity Fair magazine called the Lindberghs our first romancers of the air. Together, they made 8 transcontinental flights for TAT. They flew over Mayan ruins in Mexico and were credited wrongly with discovering a new Mayan city. In 1930, the Lindberghs had their first child, a son, Charles Jr. Reporters and photographers arrived in force. Charles publicly denounced the press for its preoccupation with his personal life. A year and a half later, the baby was kidnapped. Everyone seemed transfixed by the Lindberghs' ordeal. Clues and sightings of the child poured in from around the world. When police found the child dead only a few miles from the Lindbergh home, press photographers bribed a mortician to allow them to take pictures of the badly decomposed body.
From that point on, Charles Lindbergh and his wife draw increasingly into a shell, and it involves, understandably, some very great bitterness.
Offended that their private grief had become a public spectacle, they moved to Europe. It is a measure of their disgust with the United States that Europe seemed to them a refuge.
I think they were particularly upset by the way they had been treated by the media at that time, and that resulted in Lindbergh from that point on always having a very distant, cold relationship toward the media. They felt so exploited and abused that it was the cause, really, for them leaving the United States.
In retrospect, it was a continent ready to explode. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin set his sights on world domination. In Germany, the newly installed Nazi regime had abandoned the limits set by the armistice of World War I and was building the strongest military force in the world. In 1936, General Hermann Goering invited Lindbergh to inspect Germany's expanding air force. The American air attaché in Berlin urged Lindbergh to accept the invitation, believing that the starstruck Goering would allow Lindbergh access to previously secret German installations. Goering did, and accompanied by the military attaché, Lindbergh got the first close-up look at 2 of Germany's most potent secret weapons, the Stuka dive bomber and the Me-109 fighter. Lindbergh was fascinated by Nazi Germany. It was orderly and disciplined. The streets were clean, the people cheerful and motivated. Berlin seemed the only city in the world where he was not harassed by paparazzi, and he felt safe there in a way he hadn't since he first arrived in Paris. Lindbergh concluded that if war came, Germany would win. He returned to the United States in December 1937, and for the first time began to speak out on a subject other than aviation. Echoing the isolationist beliefs of his father, he urged the United States to keep out of European affairs. He declared the Nazis no threat and published an article in Reader's Digest that is, to modern ears, horrifying in its racism and anti-Semitism. Even after Germany invaded Poland and France, he denounced those who urged support of England as dupes of Jews and international bankers. Lindbergh took a vicious beating in the press. The hero was a traitor, an enemy of democracy, and perhaps most cuttingly, a fool. The crowds that had gathered outside his house to adore him turned ugly, screaming over the wall that America's greatest hero was a Nazi lover. When the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, Lindbergh tried to enlist. Secretary of War Henry Stimson, acting on FDR's orders, refused to recommission Lindbergh, saying that the flyer lacked faith in the righteousness of our cause. Lindbergh went to the Solomon Islands as a military observer. He had a Corsair at his disposal and joined in combat patrols over Rabaul. The other pilots loved flying with a celebrity, and no one complained. He moved on to New Guinea and flew more missions, this time in a P-38. He taught the other pilots a few fuel-saving tricks he'd learned barnstorming, and he shot down a Japanese fighter. When word reached Washington that America's most famous pilot was dogfighting without authorization, the War Department grounded him. Imprisoned by his own fame, he receded from public view. After the war, President Eisenhower reinstated his commission in the Air Force Reserve. He traveled and wrote and spent time with his children. He consulted on aviation projects, including the development of the first civilian jets. The receding hairline and paunch of advancing age became a kind of disguise for him. He was no longer slim, instantly recognizable as the Lone Eagle. The world, thankfully, had passed him by.
The Lockheed Constellation, affectionately known by many as the Connie. One of the most elegant and aesthetically pleasing aircraft to ever take flight. But being a thing of beauty was not its only grace. Lockheed took a giant technological leap to give birth to the Constellation. It was a leap so far ahead as to give Connie a lease on life, extending long after many of her prop-powered rivals rusted into obsolescence in the era of the turbojet. Her perfection of form and function can be traced to the dawn of commercial aviation. She was the end product of years of battles between the airlines for dominance of the skies. This struggle for economic survival would see the airlines and airliner evolve into their ultimate modern forms and unite the globe through air travel. In the late 20s, the fledgling American airline industry was still using aircraft like this Ford trimotor with its fixed landing gear. Technically primitive aircraft, by today's standards, and capable of short hops between cities only. Intercontinental airlines still relied on railways to ferry passengers for part of their trips. In this early age of aviation, the rules governing airlines and safety were still being written, sometimes lagging behind quickly evolving aerospace technology. Although not as dangerous as a ride with a daredevil barnstormer, a commercial flight could still be a risky proposition. A fatal crash in 1931 opened the world's eyes to the perils of flight.
That year, TWA Flight 599 came down in the Kansas prairie, killing famous football personality Knute Rockne and 7 others.
Rockne was a passenger on another type of trimotor, the Fokker F7. Unlike the all-metal Ford trimotor, it had wooden wing components, and moisture may have weakened the glue holding them together, causing them to fail during flight. Rockne was beloved by the American public, and the Rockne crash, as it became known, led to major changes in commercial aviation standards. Some improvement in speed, safety, and comfort were seen early in 1933, when the Curtiss Company launched the Condor airliner. Though it was a biplane and had a traditional frame and fabric construction, it had a tubular metal wing spar. The Rockney crash caused wooden aircraft to become the pariah of the airlines. As commercial flights became longer, passenger comfort became a greater priority. The Condor was the first aircraft to offer sleeping berths for overnight flights. Like today's airliners, it also had its own galley, providing fresh hot food and beverages for its passengers. Only about 40 Condors left the production line, and it did advance the passenger airliner, but an innovative new aircraft from Boeing would set the next benchmark for civil aviation. Boeing's Model 247 was breathtaking in comparison to anything else available, and all the airlines wanted it. It was faster than the fastest American fighter of the day, and it could beat the Condor across the USA by 8 hours. It was also a safer, more comfortable plane for its 10 passengers. It was all metal in construction and could fly in a single engine if one should fail. As well, the cabin was soundproofed and air-conditioned. The 247 was a solid design that could have dominated, but corporate greed got in the way. Boeing sold 60 of its aircraft to its affiliate airline, Boeing Air Transport, part of UATC, the predecessor to United Airlines. TWA and others were clamoring to get their own 247s, but their orders were to be postponed until the entire United order was fulfilled. Locked out, TWA and other airlines turned to aircraft manufacturers Douglas and Lockheed to build their new fleets. From Lockheed, the company that would one day create the Constellation, came the Model 10 Electra. Like the 247, it could initially carry 10 passengers, was of all-metal construction, and had twin engines. By this time, single-engine aircraft had been banned for all passenger and night flights. Kelly Johnson, then a student assistant at the University of Michigan, did much of the wind tunnel work on the Electra. He was a champion of the Electra's twin tails, which would later become a hallmark of Lockheed aircraft. Johnson would become a leading light at Lockheed and contribute to the Constellation's design. The Electra was a decent alternative to the 247, but Douglas had an aircraft in the works that would eclipse both of them and come to dominate civil air travel. TWA had turned to Douglas when their 247 orders had been rejected. The airline was looking for a new trimotor, but Douglas answered with a groundbreaking line of aircraft. The DCs, short for Douglas Commercials. These twin-engine, all-metal aircraft had the range and seating capacity to knock all competitors out of the sky. From the prototype DC-1 to the DC-2 to the DC-3, seating went up from 12 to 14 to 21. In terms of performance, the DC-3 could fly eastward across the USA in 15 hours, with just 3 refueling stops. Hundreds of DC-3s were constructed, compared to just 75 Boeing 247s. With so many of their planes in the air, Douglas had a major role in popularizing air travel. But for all the improvements that had taken place, aircraft manufacturers still had a long way to go in terms of performance and comfort achieved by a pressurized aircraft like the Constellation. Pressurizing an airliner would allow passengers and pilots to fly comfortably at higher altitudes and in the jet stream, cutting flight time and fuel costs. But it wasn't until 1937 that the first U.S. experiments got underway. It was in that year that the U.S. Army commissioned Lockheed to modify a standard Model 10 Electra with a new pressurized fuselage. The XC-35 was a watershed in aircraft design. It was an experimental aircraft constructed to prove that it was feasible to fly above the storms. Windows were smaller than found on the Electra for fears of a blowout. All these modifications allowed the XC-35 to fly at 30,000 feet and take advantage of the jet stream. The age of pressurized aircraft had arrived. With this new technology in hand, airlines were looking ahead to a time when they could offer nonstop, coast-to-coast flights and intercontinental flights, carrying enough passengers to make such trips economically feasible. To do so, they would need an all-metal, 4-engine plane, large enough to carry 40-plus passengers over a distance of 2,000 miles. In 1935, before the first DC-3 had risen into the air, United Airlines had expressed serious interest in an aircraft with these specifications and went to Douglas for help. 5 other airlines joined United's venture, including TWA, each contributing $100,000 apiece to the project. It was a small amount of money compared to the millions their investment might return. Douglas answered their challenging specifications with the DC-4E. It was a 4-engine aircraft that could carry 42 passengers, twice as many as the DC-3, a distance of over 2,000 miles. Like the later Constellation, it had a tricycle landing gear and a triple tail. It also had air conditioning, power-boosted controls, and production versions were to be pressurized. Such an aircraft could change the landscape of civil aviation, but as development costs increased, Pan Am and TWA lost interest. The prototype DC-4E did fly in June of 1938, and testing was successful, but it was too expensive, and performance was below expectations. The project was cancelled. In the end, the prototype was sold to Japanese Imperial Airways, who secretly reverse-engineered the aircraft to create the Nakajima G5N bomber. Japan wasn't the only nation gearing up for war. In the late 1930s, with communism and fascism at odds with each other and global tensions rising, war was a possibility, and aircraft manufacturers were preparing for the battles ahead while still keeping an eye on the civil market. Boeing attempted to re-engineer their B-17 bomber to create a new airliner, the 307. Boeing fused B-17 wings, undercarriage, and tail section onto a new, wider pressurized cabin to create the 307. It could fly its passengers in comfort high above any bad weather. However, because of its B-17 heritage, the 307 still had to utilize a tailwheel, making for less safe takeoffs and landings than an aircraft with tricycle landing gear like the DC-4E. Altogether, only 10 307s were sold. At this time, Lockheed was in development of their own 4-engine passenger plane, the Model 044 Excalibur, which at first glance appeared to be a larger version of the Model 10 Electra. Howard Hughes would call for radical changes to this design that would reshape the Electra into the ultimate prop airliner. When Hughes gained control of TWA in 1939, he wanted an airliner which incorporated all the latest technology available. But no such aircraft were in the air. On top of his technical requirements, he was looking for great style and extra performance. Funding from the lucrative Hughes Tool Company was the only way Howard Hughes could pay for such an ambitious project. With cash in hand, there was little doubt that he would get his way. The final rendition of Lockheed's super airliner model was so different from the 044 Excalibur first proposed that it was also given a new name, the L049 Constellation. The plans for this streamlined, elegant aircraft fit Hughes's bill for style and performance. Lockheed designers, including Kelly Johnson, borrowed elements from other aircraft to create the Constellation. It was pressurized like the XC-35 and able to fly its crew and passengers at a ceiling of 24,000 feet. As well, its wings were adapted from those of Lockheed's P-38 Lightning, and its triple tail and tricycle landing gear were reminiscent of those of the Douglas DC-4E. Even with such a stellar design in the works, the more primitive Excalibur was not cancelled. It has been suggested that the more modest Excalibur concept had actually been kept in development to distract interest away from the greatly advanced Constellation. This was part of a ploy to keep TWA's monopoly of the Connie. Since Boeing had executed a similar maneuver to keep their 247 out of TWA's hands, there is little doubt that Howard Hughes was capable of such tactics. Just as the contracts were signed and planning for the Constellation prototype got underway, the world braced itself for war. Hap Arnold, head of the Army Air Force, voiced serious concerns over the rise of Nazi Germany. He stressed the need for a backup for the already planned B-29, a long-range bomber capable of striking the U.S.'s foes wherever they might be. Lockheed was now obliged to develop a bomber version of the Constellation, the XB-30, to play understudy to the B-29. The plan for the Connie's conversion was simple and lauded by the Air Force. Graft a Constellation's wings and tail section onto a new fuselage, housing bombs rather than passengers. In the end, however, there was no need for a backup bomber. Boeing delivered the B-29 Superfortress, and the XB-30 was canceled. The end of the XB-30 was not the end of the Constellation's military career. In December 1941, when the war came to America, the military took control of the entire L-049 project. The Constellation became the C-69, a high-speed transport aircraft for troop movement. In January of 1943, 4 years after Hughes proposed its groundbreaking design, the C-69 finally took to the skies. It was still several months before all engine problems were sorted out, and the aircraft was handed over to the Army Air Force. The second C-69 had a much more glamorous debut. Though it was still a military machine, it was allowed to be presented in striking TWA livery. Even more surprising was that Howard Hughes was allowed to pilot it trans-America on a record-breaking flight, a record at the time equal to any belonging to a modern fighter. A great deal of successful publicity was gained for all concerned, and the Connie was certainly winning hearts, but not that many orders. In fact, the total number of wartime deliveries was just 22.
The Army was in desperate need of transport aircraft. They just weren't buying them from Lockheed.
After the failure of the too advanced Douglas DC-4E, Douglas went straight back to the drawing board and produced a far less ambitious aircraft, originally known as the DC-4, with no E. It was quickly militarized into the C-54 Skymaster. C-54s had no pressurized cabin, and although they did incorporate a tricycle landing gear like the earlier DC-4E, overall they had a much simpler layout. This made for quicker production, easier service, and greater reliability, exactly what America needed in a wartime situation. With all of these advantages, the C-54s drained away the Constellation's military orders. Between 1942 and into the early post-war years, over 1,200 C-54s and DC-4s were produced. But the aviation marketplace was quickly changing. As World War II ended, aircraft manufacturers had to reverse course and focus their energies on the civilian market. A number of Skymasters found their way into post-war civil use, with some being retrofitted with pressurized cabins. It was in this early post-war period that the Constellation sales took off. Her extra size, more powerful engines, and pressurized cabin all became prerequisite features for a new generation of airliners. Luxury and comfort were now being offered, and the public was willing to pay for Constellation quality. However, Lockheed's competitors weren't ready to concede defeat. Boeing was looking to capitalize on the success and technology of the B-29. They started by creating a new tanker, the C-97. Like the proposed Lockheed XB-30, they took the wings and tail section of an existing aircraft, the B-29, and grafted them onto a new, larger double-decker fuselage. The C-97s were originally built in large numbers as Air Force tankers and freighters. However, it didn't take Boeing too long to see the lucrative potential of the airliner market. The Boeing Model 377, or Stratocruiser, was an airliner version of the C-97. With its second deck, providing much greater seating capacity and its extra range. The 377 looked like it would give the early Constellations some serious competition in the luxury airliner market. However, only 56 aircraft were produced. They certainly delivered all that was promised in the luxury department, but they proved uneconomical to run. Also, 2 serious accidents resulting from their complicated engine and propeller arrangement became a source of serious concern. Although the Stratocruiser had only a limited impact on the civilian airliner market, Lockheed and the Connie still had one more player to contend with. When the war was still raging, the Army had contracted with Douglas to make an advanced Skymaster prototype, longer and with more powerful engines, and at last with a pressurized fuselage. At war's end, Douglas would take the prototype and research paid for by the Army and use them to create their new civilian offering, the DC-6. Its overall look was somewhat more sedate than the elegant Connie, but it would still prove a very worthy adversary. Throughout the decade that followed, many modified DC-4s and hundreds of brand new DC-6s and later DC-7s fought it out with numerous generations of ever-improving Constellations. As Lockheed and Douglas tried to capture the imagination and contracts of airlines around the world, they increased the seating capacity, range, and storage of the respective aircraft. With airliners available to take passengers around the globe, the long-range airline business grew in all directions. Luxury travel was augmented by tourist and economy seating. The term coach became common at travel agents and airport check-ins. Lower fares meant higher volume and access to an entirely new market of average middle-class citizens. Douglas continued to provide transports as it had in World War II, while Lockheed created a new early warning radar aircraft, the Warning Star. Over 230 of these advanced electronic surveillance aircraft provided critical support for the Air Force and Navy, especially during the Vietnam conflict. Business was booming for Lockheed and Douglas in both the military and civilian markets, but soon their streak of good fortune would come to an abrupt end. Rival Boeing returned with an unbeatable new aircraft design, which would rattle the foundations of the airliner world, the jet-powered 707. Boeing's president, Bill Allen, had bet the company on this aircraft. The 707's swept wings, potted jet engines, and other advanced technology made the Constellation and DC-6s and 7s seem like antiques from a bygone era. In a brilliant business move, Allen created a militarized version of the 707, the KC-135 tanker, in parallel with the 707, allowing him to save money on research and development and tap into the military and civilian markets simultaneously. In 1957, the same year the 707 took flight, Lockheed unveiled its most advanced constellation, the Stratoliner. It was packed with new advanced features. The Stratoliner's turbo compound engines allowed it to fly nonstop from California to Europe. But the aircraft was costly compared to similar offerings from Douglas. As well, airlines wanted to add jets to their inventories, not only for performance, but for prestige. There was more bad news for Lockheed on the military front. Although the Warning Star would continue to play an important role as an early warning aircraft into the Vietnam War, it was ultimately superseded by the Boeing E-3 Sentry, a radar-equipped version of the 707. Douglas and Lockheed both attempted to wrench the jetliner monopoly from Boeing, but only Douglas was able to crack the market successfully with their DC-8. DC-8s and 707s battled for air supremacy, just as the DC-6s and 7s had competed with the Constellations in the years leading up to the jetliners. In the mid-70s, Lockheed did attempt a comeback in the airliner market with their jet-powered TriStar. 250 aircraft were sold, but it was far below sales targets. Lockheed exited the civilian market once and for all and instead concentrated on military aircraft. Constellations, once the most advanced airliners in the world, were gradually phased out. They were relegated to backup roles, shorter routes, and ultimately served as freighters. Connie, the queen of the skies, was a victim of old age and progress and had to abdicate her throne to the jetliner. She aged gracefully, serving smaller airlines up until the 1990s. Civil aviation went through several revolutions since the early trimotors hopped across the U.S. In this time, airlines rose and fell, and aircraft manufacturers pushed technology forward as they battled for their share of the civilian market. Today's network of airlines and aircraft unifying the globe are the end result.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.